I wanted to highlight my thoughts on Daredevil episode 2, especially since I had so much fun with the first one. But in all honesty, I wasn't able to extrapolate that much meaning out of this episode in particular, at least regarding the overall story and narrative outside of the cool theme of corrupt cops and how they are building towards the Punisher. What I did think was worth explaining, however, was its ending. In the end, Daredevil makes it to the star witness he needs to exonerate his client, and he gets there before the corrupt Eric Adams cops did. When they get in there was a hard moment where they pushed against Matt, and he stood there like a brick wall until they proceeded to kick him and beat him, despite him telling him that he was blind. Eventually, one of the cops pulls out his gun and aims it to his head. Matt pleads for them not to do it until he has no choice but to kick their asses, break a couple of arms and bones, and in the end, he screams into the night. I initially took it as rage at himself, the typical Catholic guilt thing about him being mad at himself for giving in, but upon reflection, I'm not sure. I'm trying to give the show the benefit of the doubt, though I'm sure the next episode will literally answer my question, but perhaps his anger wasn't at himself and it was just vented frustration at the city itself for putting him in a position where he needed to use violence. Violence is a vice for Matt in particular and something he actively tries to avoid because of his Catholic guilt and his history with boxing. I wanted to highlight his relationship with taking action through direct action. Not only is the name of this episode Optics that further highlights this theme I'm pointing out, but every season Matt deals with the turmoil over the joy he gets hurting bad people, and also the efficacy of doing so, and it continues to haunt him. That relationship with the responsibility of direct action is so fascinating to me right now, and I wanted to compare it to another show I've been watching, The Walking Dead. Season 5, Episode 15, Try. Rick takes direct action against the surgeon who has been beating on his wife and kid after a failed conversation with the leader of their communist-walled suburb. He takes matters into his own hands and gets permission from the wife who is being beaten to confront her bitch-ass husband. The confrontation immediately goes into a street fight, and Rick had his head bashed against the wall on the way out. By the end of it, he was on top with blood pouring down from his face, and he's just pointing his gun at everybody, ranting about survival. He pleads with the people to defer to his judgment because he and his people are survivors. The community within the walls are not. While there's a separate convo to be had about the faux suburban utopia that exists and how that has sheltered that community from having to make any hard choices and whatnot, and while Rick might be literally correct in his position about both relying on the judgment of his team and that entitled wife beaters cannot be allowed to exist in our community in any capacity, Rick also looks like a fucking crazy person, and thank God Michonne pulled up to knock him out with a blow to the back of the head. Good God, homie was tripping! It didn't matter how much truth there was to his statements or even that the steps he took were the correct steps before he took matters into his own hands, because Rick is in fact literally a crazy person, and it was correctly perceived as crazy by everybody. I want to contrast the relationship both Rick and Matthew Murdock have with taking direct action, especially when the both of them are fundamentally right and maybe even going about it in mostly the correct way. Rick is a crazy person, and Matthew Murdock dresses up like the devil. On the aesthetics front, both of them lose immediately, and at least in the 2025 neoliberal climate, aesthetics are everything. Hell, the Democrats even ran on building the wall herself and thought it was fine since they tied a woman of color to the proposition. That aside, there is something to be said about the nature of both self-perception and communal perception when it comes to direct action. Matt is not only sane, but he is smart, and for a blind man, he has incredible self-perception, and he notices when he starts to go too far. He recognizes how others see him, and it's a constant personal battle for him to maintain a well-adjusted disposition. Rick, however, has been in the wild for 5 seasons. Bro, it is crazy. He talks to himself on the regular. Did you see how big his Duck Dynasty beard was? None of that is important when it comes to the group's survival out in the wild, where everybody is free to communicate and understand one another as long as you play by the rules the group agrees to. There is also something to be said about the half-dictator, more authoritarian role Rick assumed after he killed Shane, but to be honest, I think at least in this point of the story, I think it's faded significantly, especially since Michonne and Abraham joined the group and Glenn aged up. I don't think that authoritarian role is relevant anymore, but what is a principle of trust and understanding amongst the group. Survival above all else, and the group trusts Rick to keep them alive. When not in civilization, Rick is the ideal leader, but upon returning to faux suburbanism, he is immediately recognized as the tweaker that he is. And while there is something to be said about communism being perfect in a no-profit, pure survival application, the aesthetics and understanding that need to be communicated to the rest of the community is not something that Rick is capable of getting across. Both characters embrace direct action when they recognize that it is necessary, but Rick is unapologetic despite his aesthetics because he knows he is correct, while Matt maintains consistently healthy but debilitating self-doubt about both his efficacy and his own aesthetics and morals. It's a fascinating nuance I want to continue to explore, and I wonder what our own relationships with direct action are. In Germany, 800 protesters attempted to storm a Tesla factory last year. Last summer, activists broke into a UK weapons factory and shut it down in order to stop weapons from being sent to kill Palestinian children. Luigi Mangione. I think that's all I'm allowed to say on this app. I want to start the dialogue about how we view the aesthetics of direct action, especially when the actions are morally correct. Liberals and Democrats obsess over aesthetics and stereotypically remain the party that sits on their hands. Hi, this video will be continued actually. I've been sitting on this completely finished and edited video since April 8th. That's just the nature of the content creator gig. And I wanted to include a connection to real life politics in a negative sense. What does direct action look like when the intent behind it is wrong and is illegal, and this direct action is being done against the system itself? It looks like ICE arresting a Milwaukee judge over them wanting to expedite due process. What does this mean? Well, I'm sure depending on where you get your news from, your impression of this interaction might be different, but these are the facts that have been reported. ICE officers went to this courthouse because it has been deemed a public space, which gives ICE the authority to arrest whoever they are after. Who is ICE after and who has been subject to arrest and deportation since the Trump admin has expanded their command? Legal residents. Immigrants who have come here legally and are still in the process of becoming a citizen. The arresting officers of not just this guy, but also the majority of detainees know exactly where to find these individuals because immigrants who are here legally are legally required to let the government know where they are at all times, on top of having scheduled court dates they have to attend. In the Milwaukee incident, these officers knew where the suspect they wanted to arrest was, and what the judge did next got her jailed. And Judge Hannah Duger noticed what was going on, probably understands the nature of how ICE has been quite literally disappearing people and sending them to countries they're not even from before any due process happens, and was determined to enforce the right to due process, but has yet to do so. What is due process? To those who don't know, due process is quite literally the right to go to court, to get all those long-ass legal proceedings done that determine, this is the important part, whether or not you're even guilty, and then sentencing. The Maryland man who was among the group of people deported to El Salvador erroneously was not given due process because ICE elected to utilize direct action of their own by ignoring constitutional rights and correct procedure and loading them up on a plane before anybody knew what was happening. Everybody found out when Trump was posting the videos of them being shipped off. Back to Milwaukee. Judge Hannah Baker instructed the suspect away from the hallways that would be considered a public space and towards the jury box, which was a private space. This is her juggling the suspect between safe spaces like it's tag in order to make her request, the request that got her arrested. Judge Hannah Baker, in her own courtroom, asked the would-be arresting officers to forego the arrest and just conduct the hearing and legal bits there in the very courtroom. I mean, it's good fortune they're already in the courthouse. They can just skip the arrest and get right to the due process part. That request, combined with her playing keep away from the public space, was excuse enough for the ICE agents to again ensue their own version of direct action and violate decorum, the rules of the courtroom, the law, and anything else you can think of by placing the judge under arrest and jailing her. This video started out much smaller and narrower in TV focus, but I'd like to steer the conversation even further and avoid dancing around being hyper-definitional in defining and comparing these many examples of direct action. But what I want to ask genuinely is, how do we combat this kind of direct action from the state, given that the law and enforcement themselves are subject to subversion?